this week and perhaps next week as well, we're going to look at openings. The idea being we want to reduce your anxiety in the first 10, 15 minutes of the match, and also because the opening kind of dictates the rest of the play. So if you're solid in your opening and you're solid in your middle game, the chances are you're going to win. So we're trying to get you comfortable with the King's Indian defense, which, as we mentioned last week, is a good reputation to both d4 and c4. So if someone's playing Queen's Gambit or the English system, King's Indian is perfectly viable. And I'll let Warren fill you in on all the details because he's the expert.
Cool. So yeah, as Lucas said, I'm just gonna give like a introduction to the King's Indian. Now, for your reference, you might hear it called the KID, which is the King's Indian defense, right? It's just an abbreviation, so you'll hear that. You may have also seen the KIA written. That's just the King's Indian attack. It's basically people who play the King's Indian defense as white. So just for your reference, in case you see those abbreviations, that's what that means. Now, the King's Indian defense, the basic setup for black, I'll just play a few sample moves here. You're going to just develop your knight and then fianchetto your bishop just really quickly like that. The nice thing about black's setup is it's really flexible. You can play it against pretty much any sequence of white moves except for e4, basically. Okay. No matter what white does, all of these moves are almost always fine for black. Now the most critical line that you'll be dealing with later on is going to be this, basically. Whoops. And this is called the Plata. This is the most theoretically important line. Okay. Now you might notice that black's played these moves e5 and then knight c6. Okay. That was to provoke white to close the center. And after this, black's going to try to attack on the king side. Okay. Now, in your own games, I don't know if your opponents are really going to know this with white. You may face a bunch of odd moves or sidelines. Now, one nice thing about the King's Indian is that you give white choice to do whatever he wants, basically. So your opponent may get into time trouble early on. Like I notice this especially when I play lower-rated players. If I play the King's Indian, they'll think a lot on their first few moves because they can do anything. So it's kind of confusing for them if you haven't studied a system for white. It's kind of hard to know what you're doing. Okay. Now, one thing I'll mention going back to this Mar del Plata. Now, normally when you fianchetto a dark squared bishop, or any bishop for that matter, and you castle that way, it's important you keep it for the safety of your own king. But this position is an exception. So this dark squared bishop is actually your worst piece, generally speaking. And if you can trade it off, then it's usually a good accomplishment. Now, black's best piece here is this light squared bishop on c8. This piece is your prized possession. Don't lose this almost under any circumstance, okay? So that means you're not going to be playing moves like bishop g4, okay? The bishop actually typically will just sit there for a while, okay, waiting for the right moment to come out, maybe sacrifice itself later on h3 or something like that when black starts attacking. Now, in some cases, white's even gone to extreme measures, like, for example, a common next move for white is knight e1, and then in some games, white will follow up with bishop e3, and then knight b5, and then knight a7. In some extreme cases, white will do this, just try to get this bishop on c8. Okay. This is a very, very important piece for this line. Okay. I think I sent, there are a few Mar del Plata games that I sent Lucas, so you can try to familiarize yourself with those ideas there. But I don't want to spend too much time on it because I don't know how likely it is your opponent's actually going to know it. Okay.
You'll get an email from me this evening with those games that Warren sent, and also with some other information, a reminder about the Houston Open, and also some information about chess tempo for those of you who have listed me as a coach. You have a problem set, and I want everybody to have that, obviously. So just some general reminders. So please check your emails. If not tonight, then this weekend. Stay on top of that.
Okay. So some more general notes about the King's Indian. It is a very aggressive opening because you're letting white completely occupy the center, basically. Now, the advantage that black gets for not occupying the center so early is flexibility and no weaknesses, basically. When you don't move many pawns, that's the good thing. So the problems white can have is overextending his position, his pawns getting too far down the board to protect. And for black, the problems you can run into are just being cramped, right? With white's pawns on e4 and d5, it can be hard to coordinate actions on the queen side and king side. Like white can do that pretty easily. Okay. Does anybody have any questions so far? Just about the opening setup? Like, there's pretty much nothing that will stop black from playing knight f6, g6, bishop g7, d6, and castles. There might be a few exceptions, like maybe if white tries for like g4 or something like that, then you might want to just take the free pawn or something. But I really can't think of many exceptions to black's first few moves.
As black, are you always going to play d6 basically in your fourth move?
Yeah, almost always. I mean, occasionally you won't need to. I mean, for example, here...
It seems like if they play e4, you kind of have to.
Yeah, so... Well, that's an interesting point. So I recommend against e4 playing d6. Now, Fisher actually showed that black can just castle here, actually. And e5 is not a problem because of knight e8. And black's actually going to... for example, if white tries to bolster this pawn center, black's going to break it apart with d6 followed by c5. It turns out this is actually fine for black, okay? But I don't recommend it just because it's sharp, and there's really no advantage to delaying d6. So maybe later on when you want to try to trick people with your knowledge in this opening, you could just castle. But I'm going to recommend just d6, okay? It's simpler. And then just get castled next move. Does anybody have any specific questions or anything? No? Okay. So let me then go into maybe a couple sidelines. So the fact that black can play e5 is, let me just go into this a little bit, d6. It's dependent on white's pawn in e4 being a little bit loose, okay? Now, you have to be careful about this. So, for example, instead of white playing e4, if we just say he plays knight f3 instead, then after you castle, say this kind of stuff happens. Now, normally you want to play d6 and e5, but here it doesn't work because white has nothing hanging on e4. He can just take the pawn, and black emerges with no compensation, basically, right? So do remember that e5 is only playable because of white's vulnerable pawn center. So instead, in this position of playing e5, you can play a couple of different setups. One that I like is knight f d7, actually. It may look kind of bizarre blocking in your own bishop, but since you know what black's idea is, the point is you're going to play e5 next move. And you're going to follow it up probably by knight c6 and f5, okay? And you're going to have your typical kingside play. So that's like one example where you really need to support e5. Now, for the record, like knight bd7 is also fine, okay? And white may try a different setup by playing this move g3. Okay. Now with this move, white's just trying to put more pieces next to his king to make it safer, right? And against this, normally the center is not closed actually. So for example, I'll just play out a few moves. Now here again, e5 is not a good idea because it's just a free pawn. Remember, the only reason you can play e5 is because of that e4 weakness. Otherwise, you have to support it. So here you can play knight d7 or knight c6. Either one is fine. Kasparov typically played knight bd7. I think knight c6 is just fine too, but that was his preference. So for example, you might go like this, and of course you're going to play e5. Now, against the Fianchettoed variation, and this is important, you want to open up the center by taking on d4. So for example, here, you can play c6, that's kind of like a waiting move, but in general, you really want to open this up, okay? Because a kingside attack with white's bishop on g2 is just not as effective because it's one extra piece defending the king. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Now, in this position, avoid this move rook e8. This is like a common theme in the King's Indian because white will play d5, okay?
Oh.
It may not look like a big deal, but black's going to have to waste 2 tempi effectively because the rook is misplaced on e8. Because black needs to support this f5 break, right? But with a rook on e8, it's just not supporting it, right? So he's going to move it back and then play like rook f8 followed by knight e8 and then f5. so waste the tempo. So remember, in this kind of position where you want to take on d4, take right away and then play rook e8. The move order is kind of important there. So let's see. Does anybody have any questions so far? I'm covering a lot pretty fast. So
in lower levels, white players,
Sure.
all players pretty much, like using their queens quite a bit. Is there any way to get white could get his queen involved in any threatening way?
Not really. I mean, that is one nice thing about the King's Indian defense is that there's really no threatening square for the white queen early on. Now, one way he might try to threaten you is by playing the Saemisch, which is e4, d6, f3, castles, bishop e3, and white's attending queen d2 and bishop h6, kind of similar to the Yugoslav attack and the Sicilian defense, right? You guys are familiar with the dragon and the Yugoslav attack? Okay, yeah, it's pretty much the same situation, except white's d pawn's still there, black's c pawn, and white's pawn is on c4. Some slight differences, but
so that f3 move is just to prevent knight g4, like in a Sicilian.
Yeah, basically. In the Saemisch, f3 is trying to support e4 and also stop this knight g4 move, so it's kind of dual purpose. Nowadays, the Saemisch, well, I shouldn't say it's fallen out of favor. It's actually growing in popularity because of the strength of the Grunfeld defense. I'll mention why in a second, but a good setup against this. By the way, playing e5 is perfectly fine. Like, if you want to play e5, you can. Those setups are perfectly good. Now, I sent Lucas a game between Karpov and Kasparov in one of these Saemisches, where all of Karpov's pieces of white were on the back rank, and it was beautiful, right? So you can definitely play e5 against the Saemisch. So, but the most popular method nowadays is to try for Benoni setup with c5. Are you guys familiar with what the Benoni is? Okay, yeah, I should have mentioned that. So the Benoni is like a close cousin to the King's Indian defense, and occasionally it's a little bit better to play c5 instead of e5. And when that happens, basically the Benoni is just this pawn structure from e7 to d6 to c5, and your pawn breaks are going to be e6, trying to open up the e file, and going for b5, trying to open up the queen side. Just briefly mentioning that. Yeah, so that's the Saemisch. At Euro level, I would imagine most people would probably end up playing the classical, but after e5, they're probably not going to know what they're doing. Okay. For that, by the way, I attached a game between Kasparov and I can't remember who was playing, Pickett or something like that. Maybe it was someone else, but it is worth knowing what to do in the exchange variation. So, for example, here, if white just takes right away, okay. Now, knight takes e5 is obviously not special because of knight e4, okay? Now, if he tries to move like bishop g5, though, whoops, not knight e5. Now, bishop g5 is a little bit more annoying. You know what white's threatening here? If it's white's move, he wins right away.
Knight d5.
Yeah, well, that move order may actually work too, but I mean, simplest is bishop takes and then knight d5.
Oh, okay.
Just threatening the bishop on f6 and c7, right? So, like, for example, say black plays some weird move like this, then c7 and f6 hang, right? But against this, black can just defend the knight with, like, knight d7. And now if white tries to pursue with knight d5, you can just play c6. Okay. And in this particular position, you don't have to worry about giving up the two bishops because white's pawn center is kind of shaky. Okay. Now another point I'll mention is the weakness of the d4 square for white. And white has to be a little bit careful about that. So one example I'll give, so say you play e5 here and white decides, I'm not going to hurry to castle. I want to see what black's going to do since I know he's going to attack me on the king side. I'm going to play this move h3, okay? And now as black, you say, okay, I'm going to play knight c6, okay? No, white should be concerned about taking on d4, but well, what's a good way to mention this? Let me avoid h3 actually, or b2. So let's say white plays h3, then for example e5. Now let's say bishop g5. Whoops. That's actually all okay. I'm trying to think of some innocuous. Okay, let's say a3. Okay. Now in this position, black has a really strong move. And this is kind of common in King's Indian.
Knight a5 is tempting.
Well, knight a5 loses to b4.
It does.
Let's see. I don't know. I feel like knight d4, but I'm not pretty sure why though. But let's see. Okay, so it's knight d4. Wait, no, the pawn's still.
And I guess this black's not winning, by the way, but his position's very good.
I'm thinking knight e7, but
Yeah, knight e7 is okay, but black has much better.
I was trying to see if there's a way you can
Knight
like,
h5 and then f4.
Well, knight h5, he can take the knight, right?
Is it knight d4?
it's not knight d4 though. I don't think it really. You double up the pawn.
I think knight e4 he takes.
Yeah, and then you take with the pawn.
Queen recaptures.
But then you can take a bit.
Oh, then you have knight discovery tricks, don't you?
Oh gosh. Okay, so let me flush that. Okay, so knight d4, you can't take with the knight. You take with the knight, and then pawn takes knight.
Knight e8.
I don't know.
To reroute to like e6.
Queen.
You're on the right track.
Yeah, queen wouldn't take because then you could do discovered on the bishop on queen on d4, right? With it, you're not.
What discovery are you referring to?
Well, okay, so if you go knight d4, he takes back with the knight.
Yeah.
This is an hope chess. He takes back with the knight. You take pawn. If queen takes pawn, then you move knight to h5. You have to discover.
Do I just move the queen?
Huh?
You can discover, but if your knight doesn't attack anything, then it's,
Oh,
I just move the queen, right?
but then if he moves queen, then there's an attack. There's a pin on the knight, right?
Could
Could
knight
you take the knight after?
Knight takes d5 or something afterward?
Like if knight d5, queen d5, right?
Oh yeah.
Wait, okay, so.
There is a good discovery, but you gotta find it.
Oh, okay.
You can't play knight d4 unless you see the
All
discovery.
right, okay, knight d4.
Well, there is a discovery.
So knight d4.
Yeah.
Knight takes d4.
But only one works.
Pawn takes.
Yeah, I'll tell you that after queen takes d4, black wins. But
Okay, so so we're at queen takes d4.
Yeah.
Okay, so then.
Oh, knight takes e4.
yes.
Knight takes d4.
Because there, if white plays queen takes, then the queen is on the same file as the king, and then rook e8.
Oh,
Yes.
Oh.
Because I remember earlier you said something about that dark square bishop
Okay.
being really important attacker.
So this is kind of a common tactic in King's Indian here. So this is crushing because
Yeah.
we pin it, right?
It's dead.
Why doesn't knight just take?
Why do you take with the bishop?
Yeah,
wait,
bishop.
yeah, my bad.
Yeah.
Gosh, I was halfway there.
You can play that in their blitz matches though. That's
Okay, that was once.
Yeah, now this actually occurs more commonly like the Saemisch. So, for example, if like f3, say castles, say like in this position, we can again play knight d4, right? Because white can't get rid of this knight so easily. Because again, we have the same tactic, right?
Okay.
Yeah. So this is kind of common. So, and generally speaking, even in these kind of positions, like for example, after bishop takes, e takes, even if you're in a similar type position where you can't win the pawn back, it can be worth to sack the pawn and you get white star squared bishop. So that's also something I should have mentioned before. Now, white star squared bishop is his best minor piece in the King's Indian, okay? Because most of his pawns are usually going to be on light squares. So his best piece is the star squared bishop. Yeah, black's is a light squared bishop, okay? But in this kind of position, if you can win white star squared bishop, even at the price of a pawn, it can be worth it. Because suddenly your bishop becomes a monster with this open diagonal, and white star squares look kind of lonely, right? Especially in this kind of Saemisch position where he plays f3. So that's always a tactic to look for. Now, I also attached a game in the library. You'll see where it's a locked position and black moves the e pawn, sacrificing it, just to open up the star squared bishop.
Okay.
So that's something to look at too. Okay. Does anybody have any questions or concerns about black's opening so far? No? Okay. Well, I mean, it's kind of hard to... I'm not sure if it's worth it for me to delve into like the Mars or Plata or anything specifically. I can mention the reason why Kasparov supposedly stopped playing the King's Indian. Now, he stopped playing it because of what's called bayonet, at least supposedly. So that runs like this. And just immediately b4. And if you look at Kasparov's last King's Indian game, it was actually a loss in the bayonet to Kramnik. Okay, like in '97 or something like that, right? Yeah, I mean, the real reason he stopped playing the King's Indian was because he also played the Sicilian. And it was going to be a lot of work playing both the King's Indian and the Sicilian defense, because they're both very sharp chess openings. And at the top level, you really need to be on the cutting edge of theory so you don't lose, okay? Now, I'll also mention that the King's Indian is not really so popular at the top level anymore because it's a very sharp and risky opening, right? And most top players now, they hate losing. So if there's even a risk of losing, they want to avoid that. Now, some top players were able to play it with great effect that had great energy, like Kasparov, great example, Fischer, another one. One modern day one would be Radjabov. He was pretty successful. Nakamura still plays it now and then, although even he's moved a little away from it. So you can definitely play it. Just know that it's going to be a sharp game. You're going to have lots of energy, right? Now, I don't know if your opponents are going to know critical lines, but... You know.
If you want to switch away from the King's Indian defense when you hit 2,600, that's cool.
Yeah, this should definitely be sufficient to crush newbies, you know, crush weak players. Yeah. There's pretty much no better opening than the King's Indian defense if you want to play for a win, just because it's so flexible. There's so many choices at every move for each side. So if you want to win, which you guys should be wanting to at this stage, then it's a great opening for that. So
now, is it too sharp to play in like a G25?
No.
I mean, no, it's still okay.
Yeah, if
what do you mean?
Yeah, well, I mean, I was just thinking about the short time, but yeah, G120, I feel like it'd be comfortable, but...
I mean, if you know the position's better than your opponent, then they're going to be just as concerned as you are.
Okay, got it.
I mean, one comforting thing, at least playing the King's Indian, is that if your attack succeeds, the rewards are much greater because you're attacking the king. Mm-hmm. So if your attack succeeds, you win the king. Now, if White's attack on the queen side succeeds, he wins a pawn or something like that, right?
Okay.
So that's one comforting thing, at least. In a blitz game, White's going to have to be more concerned, right? Because if he miscalculates, he gets checkmated.
Right, yeah, I see what you're saying. Okay.
So... Yeah, I don't think I mentioned that explicitly, but generally speaking, White's going to be attacking on the queen side, and Black's going to be attacking on the king side. You know, for example, say like 91, 98. This is like a really common opening setup right here. And Black ends up playing moves like f4, g5, and he's going to move these kingside pawns up the board to try to pry open that white king.
And how is Black going to get his queen involved in that attack?
Usually Black will try to move the knight somehow. So this knight will come to g6, and he'll try to achieve g4. Fischer introduced an interesting idea, and I linked you the game where he showed it. So one black idea is to play h5, knight g6, knight h8, knight f7, knight h6.
Wow.
It kind of seems excessive, but in these kind of closed positions, you have time for that maneuver. Now, the idea is that you're going to try to force through g4, because white's going to play moves like f3, h3, and you put that in f2. White's going to try to stop g4 at all costs, right? Because if you break in with g4, it turns out black has a pretty strong attack usually. So when white piles on the pieces like that, black can do the same, right? Knight in f6, knight in h6, bishop on c8, and pawn at h5. Usually then black can force through g4.
So that light square bishop that you're talking about, that's just going to sit there for a while.
Yeah.
It's not just sitting there; it's playing an active role in the attack.
Exactly. It's supporting this crucial move G4. So that's why it's so important.
So where does that leave the queenside rook? Is it just going to maybe float over to B1 and try to prevent a pawn break over there?
So typically it actually stays there. Okay. Occasionally it can move to the C file if white opens that up, or sometimes it can help support A5. So one alternative to this opening for black. So I'll give you one example. So instead of white castling, there's what's called the Petrosian variation with d5. Okay. Now the advantage of this move is it stops black's knight from getting to the king side and contributing to the black's king side attack. But the downside is that black has this interesting move knight a6. Okay. Now the idea is that black's going to establish a really nice bind on the queen side. So for example, castles, knight c5, attacking the c4 pawn. Now if queen c2, a5. And here the black's rook presence on a is actually important. Now this knight on c5, a5 pawn setup is really something to remember for you guys, because if you can achieve this, it's usually excellent for black, because you can slowly accumulate your kingside play, while white's play on the queen side is really stymied. For example, a3 is like a positional blunder here, because a4 is just amazing for black. Now this is so good for black because this one black pawn holds back these A and B pawns. And this kind of pawn structure is great. This knight alpha is where b3 can go to, so this is something to look out for. Now instead of a3, white has to play the slow b3, followed by a3 and then b4. But it does take some time to arrange. Okay. Now I'll also mention that in the King's Indian too, bishop e3 is almost always bad for white because of knight g4. For example here, if bishop e3, knight g4 is just great, because white can't afford to lose a dark square bishop, and you gain a tempo for playing f5. So bishop e3 is almost never something that's you need to be afraid of. But yeah, so some common themes to remember, like Lucas mentioned, the bishop on c8 typically doesn't move when the pawn structure is closed like this, right? And you definitely want to play f5, okay? And don't worry if white tries to trap dark square bishop. If white's playing moves like bishop d2, queen c1, trying to trade off that dark squared bishop, don't worry about it. He's not going to checkmate you with his closed position like this. He's just trading off his best piece for your worst piece.
Yeah, and if ever that bishop does move to h6, don't take it.
Oh, yeah.
Let it capture on g7 and recapture the king. Okay.
Yeah, it can be dangerous to let the white queen down here in that case.
Yeah.
Because then he can play knight g5 and you can get checkmated.
Yeah. And generally, when you're on defense, let them come at you, because in a sense they're using Tempe to do it, and while they're trying their hardest to trade off your dark square bishop, which is what Warren said is your worst piece on the board, you're developing your knights to more advantageous squares, and then when they trade, you thank them for spending all that time doing it, and then continue on with your attack, and you're fine.
Anybody have any specific questions or anything, or general questions?
Can white throw some pieces down the board? You could throw some pawns down the board to try to crack open black's king side? He
can. So there's a variation that... So we saw a game from that book, The Art of Planning, actually, where white played this Bakaganov system with h3. Now, I mentioned, too, that Conrad Holt's kind of a specialist in this. Now, h3, ostensibly, may look like the idea is to play bishop e3, but main reason is so white can play g4. So, for example, say e5, d5, white's idea is going to be to play g4, okay? Now, black actually has to be careful here, because if you pursue the knight a6, c5 plan, it's very dangerous because white can play g4 here. and then after knight c5, white's going to have this nice bind on the king side. Now, instead of attacking black, white's idea is more to restrict black's kingside play. Because now if you achieve f5, you're going to open up this g file, which white can utilize to attack your king. You have to be a little bit careful. So because of that, to combat this g4 idea, knight h5 has become a nice response to this. Because now if g4, knight f4 is just amazing. Now you can even play this in situations where you sacrifice a pawn. Again, because if white takes this knight, your bishop becomes a monster, right? So in response to this, knight h5 is fine. Now on the Saemisch, white has similar ideas. Now white can aim for g4 ideas. You know, for example, he can try to play g4 here right away, okay, and try to just attack you in Yugoslav style by playing h4, h5, sack, sack, mate, right? Of course, it's not that easy, but
In our dreams, it is.
it feels like it if you go over Fischer's games. But yeah.
Speaking of sacking, you talked about the light square bishop being able to sacrifice itself, perhaps to open up attacking lines.
Oh yeah.
On the king.
What's a good example? I don't know if I sent you a specific example. I'll just go over like some Mar del Plata theoretical game. So let's say white doesn't really know what he's doing. Okay. So we have a typical Mar del Plata. He knows 91. He knows that much. And from here, I can try this. So let's say white just kind of does random things. Okay. Now, let's say knight f6. Yeah.
You're attacking g4.
Does take a little bit of time to build up. But we'll just assume white keeps building up. Yep. So g3 is often a good way to continue the attack because if white takes, then these dark squares become kind of weak. So if white tries to close it up, though, then you can attack anyway. So say, for example, this. You know, white tries to do something over here. And now you can play a move like this. Let's say white still doesn't really know what he's doing. Now you can just like sack, for example. And then, you know, white's having to sacrifice a rook and then he just dies, right? You know, you can even have fun, like, yay.
Wow.
Can't save the rook, right?
So that's why rook f2 is obligatory because of the
it's made on h2.
oh yeah, there's that, yeah. I made one.
Yeah, so this is just like an example, but it's a common tactic for black to sacrifice on h3 because in some cases too, black, like I mentioned, here I was just playing bad moves for white, but white will sometimes try to play h3 to stop this g4 advance, right? And in some cases, black can sacrifice on h3. So you can play, you know, like knight g6, h4, and then you can consider sacrificing. So the bishop is basically useful for supporting g4 and getting rid of a white defender on the king side. So that's usually what you're going to end up doing with it. Any other questions?